You were never meant to hear this. That's not just a warning. It's a truth. What I'm about to tell you was buried beneath marble, money, and madness for more than a century. A story that whispers through the cracks of New York's Gilded Age mansions, in the shadows where wealth and rot become the same thing. Most people know the Gilded Age as glitter, chandeliers, ballrooms, gold pocket watches glinting under gaslight. But what they don't see, what they were never supposed to see, is the price of that shine. Every empire has its blood, every fortune its grave. And in the winter of 1885, in a limestone mansion on Fifth Avenue, one woman stumbled onto a truth so unbearable, so dangerous, that the men who ruled America would rather drive her into madness than let her speak it aloud. Her name was Nina Fairchild. To the world, she was a perfect socialite, poised, radiant, the wife of Wall Street's most brilliant mind, Theodore Fairchild. They called him the Oracle of Exchange Place. A man who could predict the market with almost supernatural precision. Rivals said he had a gift, a sight beyond numbers, a way of knowing who would fall and when. But gifts like that never come free. And as Nina would discover, her husband's foresight was not divine inspiration. It was something darker, something orchestrated, something designed to keep a small circle of men at the top while the rest of the country bled beneath their boots. That night in November, her dining room gleamed with crystal and silver, the air thick with roasted duck and imported cigars. 3 titans of industry sat across from Theodore, their voices low, their eyes sharp. Harrison Kensington, Marcus Cromwell, James Wright. They were not just business partners, they were something else. A council of hidden power, bound by silence and sealed by blood. Nina should never have heard the words, the Pittsburgh problem. She should never have seen the flicker of fear in her husband's eyes as his hand trembled over his wineglass. She should never have been in that room at all. But she was. And what happened next shattered her world and dragged her into the underbelly of a system built on death. This is not just the story of a grieving widow who lost her mind. This is the story of a woman who saw too much. And once you hear what she uncovered, you'll understand why madness was the only ending they allowed her. Theodore Fairchild's death was declared a heart attack. Quick, clean, respectable. That's how the newspapers told it anyway. They praised his genius, his devotion to industry, his tireless pursuit of progress. To the world it was a cautionary tale. Even the mighty can collapse under the weight of ambition. But inside the mansion at 847 Fifth Avenue, Nina could not shake the truth her eyes had witnessed. The way her husband gasped for air, the look of terror, pure, animal terror, that crossed his face as if he had recognized his killer in that very moment. She remembered how swiftly his dinner guests took control. Kensington whispering orders, Cromwell signaling servants, Wright guiding her gently but firmly away from Theodore's body, as though her grief were an obstacle to be managed, not a tragedy to be consoled. Even the physician who arrived, Dr. Henley, spoke with a tone that felt rehearsed. A man of great responsibility, a heart weakened by stress. His words were too neat, too tidy. Nina wanted to believe them. She tried to. But the seed of suspicion had already rooted itself in her mind, and grief only watered it deeper. In the days that followed, the Fairchild mansion became a mausoleum of whispers. Men in black coats came and went through the study, carrying papers she wasn't allowed to see. Theodore's business empire was now hers, they told her, but only in name. The real management, the decisions, the deals, they encouraged her to hand those responsibilities over to trusted associates, for her health, for her delicate state. Always those words, delicate, fragile, unstable, words that sound like comfort but are used as chains. It was during these days of mourning that she first noticed something chilling. Theodore's documents, his ledgers, his private correspondences, they weren't just about profits, they were about disasters, train derailments, mine collapses, factory fires. He had anticipated them all, but not anticipated, arranged. The timing was too perfect, the profits too sharp. He knew when rivals would fall, because he and his circle made sure of it. Nina stared at the coded letters, the clipped newspaper clippings, the telegrams signed only with initials. She tried to tell herself she was imagining things, that grief had warped her reason. But the pattern was undeniable, and in those long nights alone in the mansion, as the gas lights flickered against velvet drapes, she began to understand what her husband truly was. Not a prophet, not a genius, but an architect of ruin. And if Theodore had been part of such a machine, then perhaps his death wasn't tragedy at all. Perhaps it was correction, a message, a sacrifice. In the weeks after the funeral, the mansion's silence became unbearable. The chandeliers still glimmered, the carpet still muffled footsteps, but something unseen pressed against the walls, watching, listening. Elena felt it most in Theodore's study. That room had always been his sanctuary, off limits even to her. Now, with the door unlocked and his desk bare, it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. She discovered the locked drawer by accident, hidden beneath layers of false compartments. Inside lay a collection of documents so disturbing that her hands shook as she read them. Ledger entries aligned perfectly with disasters. Telegrams mentioned resolutions and permanent solutions, and one letter, signed with the initials HK, spoke of the Pittsburgh problem, the very phrase she'd overheard the night Theodore died. Harrison Kensington, of course. The man who had guided the room like a general. The man who whispered to Dr. Henley when Theodore's body was still warm. The realization hit her with the weight of iron. Theodore's death wasn't natural, it was planned, and Kensington had been involved. But what chilled her more was not the implication of murder, it was the scale. The documents hinted at a network of men across finance, shipping, mining, railroads, a hidden council directing collapses and rises like pieces on a chessboard. Competitors didn't fail by chance, they were eliminated. Fortunes didn't rise through genius, they were engineered, harvested from blood and ruin. Elena sat alone in that study, staring at her husband's handwriting, and a sickening truth dawned on her. The wealth she had worn in silk gowns, the chandeliers above her dinner tables, the very mansion she lived in, all of it was built on orchestrated death. Theodore had not been a man of vision, he had been an executioner dressed in velvet. Her grief turned to rage, and then to fear. Rage, because the man she loved had lived behind a mask. Fear, because if she could piece this together, others would know she could. And the kind of men who manipulated markets with corpses would not hesitate to silence a widow who asked too many questions. The servants whispered now when she passed. Friends stopped calling. Even at charity events, she felt the air change when she entered the room. It wasn't grief isolating her, it was exile. She had seen too much, and the circle was closing. By the spring of 1886, Elena's grief had hardened into obsession. She spent entire nights in Theodore's study, mapping connections with ink-stained fingers, tracing disasters against the rise of fortunes. The patterns were undeniable. Every mine collapse, every derailment, every accidental fire had a beneficiary, and those beneficiaries all pointed back to the same circle of men. Her husband hadn't merely participated, he had been one of the architects. But obsession is dangerous when eyes are already on you. She noticed it first in the small things. Letters on her desk moved slightly when she returned. Footsteps in the hallway when the house should have been silent. Servants she didn't recognize, faces that never seemed to meet her gaze directly. And then there was Dr. Henley. At first, he came under the guise of concern, a kindly physician checking on a grieving widow, but his questions grew sharper. Did she sleep? Did she dwell too much on Theodore's affairs? Did she experience visions, anxieties, lapses in memory? His tone suggested care, but his eyes betrayed something colder. He wasn't treating her, he was evaluating her, measuring how close she was to breaking. She began to realize the truth. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. Waiting for her grief to become paranoia. Waiting to declare her unfit, hysterical, unstable. That was how they silenced inconvenient women in the Gilded Age. Not with daggers, not with poison, but with confinement. Lock her away in some sanitarium, write her off as a tragic widow who lost her mind after her husband's death. Neat, painless, no scandal. And yet, she couldn't stop herself. Every letter she uncovered pulled her deeper. She found one document that chilled her to the bone, a ledger entry listing payments to associates for removals. Theodore had signed it himself, and just below, in another hand she did know, to recognize, a note. Ensure the widow remains docile. H. That was when she understood. They weren't waiting for her to go mad. They were engineering her madness, gaslighting her reality, bending her perception, turning her own mind into a prison cell. The realization should have broken her. Instead, it ignited something else. Resolve. If they meant to bury her sanity, she would resist. If they meant to erase her husband's crimes beneath polite society, she would expose them, but to do so meant playing a dangerous game against men who controlled not only markets, but narratives. And the most dangerous thing of all, they had already decided her fate. The decision to resist did not come in a single moment of courage. It crept in, like a fever that slowly burns away hesitation. One night, staring at the ledger with its cold language of removals and resolutions, Elena felt something inside her shift. She was no longer merely a grieving widow. She was a witness, and witnesses are dangerous. Her first act was small. She copied one of Theodore's letters, carefully tracing the script so no one would know the original had been touched. She hid it inside a hollow space in the molding of her bedroom wall, then another, and another. Soon she had created her own archive, a secret record of everything she had uncovered. If they tried to erase her, she would not vanish quietly. But paranoia grew alongside determination. At night she swore she heard the click of footsteps on the marble floors when the house should have been silent. Once, she awoke to find her lamp extinguished, though she remembered leaving it lit. Another time, a drawer she had locked was hanging open, its contents disturbed. Servants insisted she was imagining things. Dr. Henley gently suggested her nerves were fraying. And yet, every coincidence confirmed what she already knew. They were testing the edges of her mind, softening it, preparing to declare her insane. The social world she once commanded had turned cold. Invitations stopped. Old friends avoided her eyes. At one charity gathering, she overheard two women whispering that Mrs. Fairchild had lost her reason. The narrative was already being written, line by line, in polite conversation and hushed gossip, and once society agreed you were hysterical, there was no return. Still, Elena pressed forward. She pieced together Theodore's dealings with Kensington, Cromwell and Wright. She traced coded telegrams that suggested not just market manipulation, but something deeper, coordination. With political figures, judges, even journalists, this was not merely a circle of greedy businessmen, it was a system, a machine of control that reached into every institution. A shadow empire that silenced, erased, and consumed. One evening, while reading through another bundle of documents, she caught herself whispering aloud. It was never wealth they wanted. It was power, total control. The words chilled her, because they sounded less like discovery and more like initiation, as if by speaking them, she had crossed a threshold into knowledge she could never step back from. And knowledge, she now understood, was its own kind of curse. The human mind does not break all at once. It bends slowly under pressure. It bends when reality no longer feels solid, when every glance hides meaning, when every silence hums with threat. That is what Elena faced in the spring of 1886, a war not against her body, but against her sanity. She noticed the first deliberate manipulation when she returned to Theodore's study one afternoon. The papers she had left in neat stacks were scattered, some turned upside down, others missing entirely. She demanded answers from the servants, but they looked at her with rehearsed confusion. "No one has entered the study, madam." She knew it was a lie, but the denial was sharper than any admission. They weren't just taking things, they were trying to make her doubt her memory. Then came the letters. Anonymous notes slid beneath her door at night, some scrawled in a trembling hand, "Stop digging or join him." Others written elegantly, promising peace if she simply abandoned her search. She burned them in the fireplace, but the words clung to her mind. Was she truly being threatened, or imagining threats where none existed? That was the trap. The constant uncertainty. Dr. Henley's visits grew more insistent. He pressed laudanum into her palm, urging her to rest her nerves. When she refused, he warned gently that grief untreated often bloomed into hysteria. His eyes lingered too long, as though he were already measuring her for the padded walls of an asylum. She realized then that medicine itself had become a weapon, a way to erase her voice by labeling it sickness. Every layer of her life was being dismantled. Friends who once laughed at her table now crossed the street to avoid her. Newspapers printed subtle insinuations about her fragile state. Even her reflection seemed altered, shadows deepening under her eyes, lips tight with suspicion. Was she unraveling, or were they weaving a cage around her, strand by strand, until madness became inevitable? One night, as she stood by the tall windows of the mansion, she saw him. A man in a dark coat, watching from across Fifth Avenue, motionless as a statue. When she blinked, he was gone. Had he ever been there? She could no longer trust her own senses. And that was the cruel genius of their game. Once you doubt yourself, the battle is already half lost. But Elena whispered to herself in the silence, clutching her hidden archive like a talisman. They will not break me, not yet. Defiance can be louder than a scream, even when spoken only in silence. By early summer, Elena decided she would not sit quietly while they carved her into a ghost. The documents she hid were no longer just evidence, they were her only weapon, and weapons, she knew, had to be used. Her first act of rebellion was writing a letter, not to Kensington, not to Cromwell or Wright, but to a trusted childhood friend in Boston, someone untouched by New York's gilded circle. In the letter, she explained little, only that she feared her husband's death was no accident and that she possessed records dangerous enough to ruin powerful men. She didn't sign her name. She didn't need to. But she wrote one line that carried all the weight of her resolve. If anything happens to me, know that it was no madness, but murder disguised as mercy. She never knew if that letter made it to its destination, but writing it changed her. For the first time, she had planted a shadow of herself outside their reach, a trace they could not easily erase. That night, her dreams came alive with fire and collapse. She saw railroads buckling, miners crushed beneath stone, ships vanishing in violent waves. And in every dream, she saw Theodore's face, not as her husband, but as a priest of ruin, orchestrating the suffering with ink and coin. She awoke, trembling, drenched in sweat, whispering words she didn't understand. The empire feeds on sacrifice. By day, the world around her tightened its grip. At a dinner hosted by an old acquaintance, she overheard Cromwell's name spoken with reverence, as if his fortune were blessed by Providence. No one dared mention the shipwrecks that had cleared his competition. No one dared acknowledge the blood behind the marble. That silence, that complicity was worse than a dagger. It was proof that society itself would guard the lie. And yet, the more she uncovered, the more a dangerous clarity took root. Her husband's circle was not just a cabal of greedy men. They were part of a structure older than the Gilded Age, older than America itself, a network that had always existed in some form, weaving wealth out of ruin, power out of death. Theodore had been a player, not the architect, which meant others, many others, still moved the pieces. Elena looked into her mirror one night and barely recognized her own face. But in her eyes, there was something new, not madness, not hysteria. Fire. Retaliation never comes all at once. It drips, steady and suffocating until you no longer know which way is up. For Elena, it began with small humiliations. Servants whispered that she wandered the halls at night speaking to shadows. A misplaced bracelet was suddenly found in her own vanity drawer, though she knew she had not placed it there. One morning, the cook informed her that she had raved in her sleep, calling out names she had never spoken aloud. Lies, all of it. Yet each rumor spread like fire through the gilded salons of New York until she felt the city itself turning against her. But the whispers were only the surface. More brutal games followed. A letter arrived on her desk sealed with Theodore's monogram. For a moment her heart stopped, her husband's handwriting on the page. "Stop digging," it read, "for both our sakes." Her breath caught in her throat. Was this a cruel forgery? Or had Theodore himself in his final days tried to silence her even from beyond the grave? She tore it apart, but the words lingered, burning. Then came the night terrors. Doors she locked were found standing open at dawn. Lamps she left burning were mysteriously extinguished. A mirror in her chamber cracked down the middle without a sound. Were these tricks of her persecutors, or signs that her own mind was fracturing? That was the genius of psychological war. The enemy never revealed himself. The weapon was doubt itself. And in the background, Dr. Henley loomed like a vulture. His visits grew urgent, his recommendations stronger: laudanum, rest, a temporary stay at his private clinic, until the strain of widowhood passed. She saw the trap clearly now. Once she entered his institution, she would never leave with her name intact. Her truth would be dismissed as hysteria, her evidence dismissed as delusions. They weren't trying to kill her, they were trying to make her disappear while leaving her body intact. One evening, through the heavy curtains of the drawing room, she saw him again, the man in the dark coat, standing across Fifth Avenue. This time, he did not vanish. He lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating a face she almost recognized, and then, with deliberate slowness, he tipped his hat toward her window. That was when she understood. They weren't merely breaking her mind. They were showing her, "We own the shadows, we decide your fate." But in that moment of dread, something within Elena sharpened. Fear had carried her this far. Now it would have to transform into something else. There is a moment when fear ceases to paralyze and instead hardens into resolve. For Elena, that moment came after the man in the coat tipped his hat. She realized then that waiting, hiding, preserving herself quietly would only lead to the fate they had planned: silence by way of madness. If she was to fall, she would fall making noise loud enough to be remembered. Her counterattack began with the archive. Until now, she had hidden the papers like sacred relics, afraid discovery would mean her end. But now she copied them, line by line, in her precise hand. She wrapped the duplicates in oilcloth and gave them to a trusted maid, instructing her to deliver the package to a journalist known for his sharp pen against corruption. The maid swore obedience, but Elena knew even this was a gamble. Loyalty could be bought, fear could be exploited, yet action was better than paralysis. The second step was bolder. She attended a gala hosted by Cromwell himself, stepping into the lion's den with her reputation already tattered. Whispers followed her through the marble halls: mad, unstable, a tragic widow. But she met every glance with unflinching poise. When she stood before Cromwell, his smile was too wide, his voice too sweet. "Mrs. Fairchild," he said, "I feared grief had kept you from the world." Her reply, sharp enough to draw blood: "Grief keeps me awake, sir, awake to many things." The words unsettled him. For the first time she saw hesitation in his eyes. But retaliation against power is never without cost. That very night, as she returned to her home, she found her archive ransacked, not destroyed, but disturbed, papers scattered across the floor, certain key documents missing. It was not theft, it was a message: "We know what you hold. We let you live only because we choose to." And then came the betrayal she feared most. The maid she had trusted never returned. Whether bribed, silenced, or worse, Elena would never know. The journalist printed nothing. Her attempt at exposure had been swallowed whole, vanishing as if it had never existed. Yet strangely, she did not despair. Instead, she felt something ancient stirring in her veins, the realization that survival was no longer the only goal. If her life was to be the price, then her death must speak louder than their silence. In the mirror that night, her reflection looked almost unrecognizable, pale, haunted, yes, but behind her eyes burned a light too wild for them to extinguish. For months they had twisted her reality, using whispers and shadows to drive her toward collapse. Now Elena decided to wield the same tools. If they wanted her madness, she would give them something far more dangerous: unpredictability. Her first move was subtle. She began sending unsigned notes to certain members of Theodore's circle, written in a hand carefully disguised. Each note contained fragments of the archive, shipping ledgers, lists of dead miners, names of creditors who had vanished without a trace. She left no explanation, only the words, "The truth always resurfaces." The effect was immediate. At salons and dinners, she watched the men exchange wary glances, lowering their voices when she entered. For the first time, she saw cracks in their armor. Next, she turned her house into a stage. Knowing they spied on her, she gave them a performance worth fearing. She ordered the servants to light candles in every window at odd hours, creating the impression of secret midnight meetings. She spoke aloud in empty rooms as if addressing unseen guests, letting her watchers wonder who might be visiting her. Once, she even allowed a neighbor to overhear her whispering, "They know what you did. Soon everyone will." By dawn, that rumor had spread like fire. Cromwell, Wright, even Dr. Henley, each began to treat her not as a fragile widow but as a possible threat. Their silence at gatherings grew tighter, their polite smiles thinner. She could feel their unease like heat in the air. They had expected her to collapse into the role of the broken wife. Instead, she had become something unpredictable, something dangerous. But danger attracts retaliation. Late one night, she returned from a carriage ride to find the lock on her study broken. On her desk sat a single candle, burned nearly to the wick, and beside it, one of her missing documents. Nothing else had been ouched. No thief would behave that way. It was a warning, placed deliberately. "We can enter your sanctum whenever we please." Still, she refused to yield. Fear was no longer her enemy. It was her disguise, her weapon. The more they tried to isolate her, the more she embraced the image of the haunted widow. If society thought her half-mad, then madness itself became her shield. Yet deep inside, a terrible question clawed at her. Was she truly performing, or was she already becoming what they claimed? At first, it was a game she controlled. She spoke to empty rooms for effect, left candles burning as signals, wrote false notes to stir paranoia. But the longer she played the part, the more it began to seep into her bones. Some nights, when she whispered in the dark, she was no longer certain whether she was pretending or confessing to something only she could see. Her reflection became a stranger. In the mirror, her lips moved when she was silent. Her eyes seemed to lag behind her own gaze. Once, as she stood brushing her hair, she swore she saw Theodore's figure behind her, his hand reaching toward her shoulder. She spun, heart racing, but the room was empty. The brush clattered to the floor. She told herself it was exhaustion, but the image lingered, stubborn and real. Sleep, too, became treacherous. Dreams bled into waking hours. She would dream of Theodore gasping for breath, his fingers clawing at invisible hands. Then, waking, she would hear the same gasps echoing in the room, though her ears told her she was alone. Sometimes she thought she smelled seawater, brine and rot, filling her lungs until she gagged. The documents in her archive, she realized, weren't just evidence, they were portals. Each ledger entry, each casualty, a doorway into another life cut short. She was carrying not just secrets, but ghosts. The men noticed the change. At a dinner, one guest whispered, "She has her husband's eyes now." Another said, "No, she has his fate." Even Cromwell, normally stone-faced, seemed unsettled when she laughed abruptly at his toast, a laugh she herself did not recognize. For a moment, the whole table fell into silence, as if the sound itself carried something unearthly. And yet, through this descent, a strange strength bloomed. Fear no longer hollowed her out, it filled her. Madness, whether real or feigned, had given her a freedom they could not counter. She could speak truths others would dismiss as delirium. She could act without warning, and they would hesitate, unsure if she was dangerous or simply unraveling. But in quiet moments, when the house was still, she pressed her palms to her temples and whispered the question that gnawed her alive. Am I resisting their control or becoming the very ruin they designed for me? The circle had tolerated her long enough. Whispers and warnings had failed. Her defiance had only grown teeth, and so one winter evening they made their boldest move yet. It began with silence. Her servants one by one failed to return from errands. The house grew emptier each day, until only one maid remained, and even she avoided Elena's eyes. At night, the gas lamps outside her windows no longer lit. Fifth Avenue itself seemed to withdraw from her, leaving her townhouse an island of darkness. Then came the doctor. Dr. Henley arrived uninvited, flanked by 2 attendants in plain coats. He carried papers already signed by the court, a decree declaring Elena unfit for independent care. Her heart froze as she read her own name beside the word committed. It was their masterstroke. No scandal, no evidence, just the soft suffocation of bureaucracy. She would be swept away into Henley's private asylum, and the world would nod politely as her voice was erased. But Elena was not the same woman they thought they could corner. As Henley explained in his syrupy tone that, "This is for your health, my dear," she laughed, a sound so sharp it startled even his attendants. "My health," she said. "You mean your conscience?" She refused to sign, refused to move, refused even to acknowledge his authority. The attendants reached for her arms. For a moment she considered surrender. The asylum would be the end. But then a fire, born of both terror and rage, surged within her. She screamed, not words, but a raw, guttural cry that shook the hall. The sound echoed through the empty townhouse, rattling windows, carrying into the street. The attendants recoiled, unnerved. Even Henley faltered, his mask of calm cracking. That scream was no act. It was the howl of a woman who had stared too long into the abyss and come back with the abyss inside her. The neighbors whispered about it for days. Some claimed it was not the widow's voice at all, but something else, something inhuman. Whether truth or rumor, it worked. Henley withdrew, muttering about another time. The decree remained in his pocket. Yet victory carried a terrible cost. When the house fell silent again, Elena felt her hands trembling uncontrollably. She had escaped for now, but she no longer knew whether her survival came from strength or from a madness so deep it frightened even her enemies. She knew they would never stop. Cromwell, Wright, Henley, men like them did not forgive disobedience. They erased it. The asylum papers were proof. Her fate was already written, unless she rewrote it herself. For weeks she withdrew from society, letting gossip swell. The city whispered that she had finally broken, that the widow lived locked in her rooms, speaking to no one. That was exactly what she wanted them to believe. Behind those shuttered windows she was writing, drafting a manifesto stitched together from her archive, her husband's hidden ledgers, and her own observations of the circle. Every page was an indictment, a map of their crimes, their fortunes, their names. She knew no single paper would publish it, but she did not need one. She planned to scatter copies like seeds into every corner of New York. But words alone were not enough. The circle thrived in silence, in the safety of backrooms. To defeat them, she had to drag them into the open, so she devised a performance that would leave no room for whispers. She chose the Metropolitan Opera House as her stage. On the night of its grandest performance, she appeared in black silk, her veil trailing like a shadow. Guests gasped to see her, the mad widow, walking with the poise of a queen. At intermission, while the chandeliers glimmered and the city's elite mingled, she ascended the grand staircase. Every head turned, and then, from beneath her cloak, she scattered sheets of paper down the steps, pages filled with names, ledgers, and accusations. "You call me mad," she declared, her voice carrying through the hall. "But madness is only seeing the truth when others choose blindness." The reaction was chaos. Some guests scrambled to collect the papers, others fled, as if touching them might curse their hands. Cromwell himself was present, his face hard as stone, watching the spectacle he could not contain. For the first time, the circle was forced into the public eye. But triumph is never pure. As guards rushed to remove her, Elena felt no fear, only a strange calm, as though she had stepped beyond herself. Yet in the corner of her vision, she thought she saw Theodore again, standing at the edge of the crowd, his face pale, his mouth moving silently. She could not hear the words. Was it approval, a warning, or simply another crack in her unraveling mind? The city erupted the next morning. Some papers printed cautious lines about a widow's derangement. Others hinted at financial improprieties among respected men, careful not to name names. But the streets told the truer story. Copies of her pages circulated in taverns and boarding houses, read aloud in hushed voices. Clerks recognized the handwriting of ledgers they had once tallied. Dockworkers muttered that at last someone had spoken what they had long suspected, that fortunes were being built on bones. For the first time, the circle felt exposed. Cromwell and Wright issued stiff public statements, all smiles and denials. Dr. Henley, red-eyed, claimed the widow's papers were the ravings of an unstable mind, yet behind closed doors, their allies began to tremble. A banker quietly withdrew from a deal. A senator failed to appear at a private meeting. The circle's strength was secrecy, and secrecy had been pierced. But Elena paid dearly for her blow. When she returned to her townhouse, she found the word hysteria scrawled across her front door in chalk. Anonymous letters piled at her steps, some praising her courage, others promising she would meet the rope. Carriages slowed to jeer. Her once proud name was now both feared and mocked. And in the silence of her rooms, the haunting grew worse. She began to hear Theodore's cough at odd hours, faint but distinct, echoing from the walls. Sometimes the papers themselves seemed to shift when she was not looking, as if unseen hands reordered them. Once, she awoke to find every sheet spread across the floor in a perfect circle around her bed. The servants had long since abandoned her. No one could have arranged it. Still, she pressed on. She sent more copies into the city, hidden in prayer books, slipped into the pockets of market stalls. Each act spread both truth and terror. She was winning ground, but also losing herself. Late one night, as she sat surrounded by candlelight, she realized something terrible. Whether the visions were real or born of her fractured mind, they no longer mattered. Because now, she needed them. The ghosts, the whispers, the presence of Theodore, they were her only companions, the only ones who understood what she had unleashed. And in that moment, she whispered into the dark, "If madness is my crown, then let it be the sharpest crown they ever wear." The circle could no longer afford hesitation. Whispers were spreading too fast, and Elena had become a symbol they could not control. If she lived, others might follow her example. If she died, her death would have to serve as its own warning. One storm-heavy night, as the city streets churned with mud and rain, they came for her. Not in daylight, not with papers and courts, but with shadows. 3 men, faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, slipped past the iron gates and entered her home. The locks had been forced with the ease of long practice. Upstairs, Elena sat awake, listening to the steady drip of water from a leak in the ceiling. She knew they would return. She had been waiting. The first intruder reached her study and found the floor covered in documents, candles burning low, and Elena standing at the center, her veil pulled back. She did not scream. She did not flee. Instead, she spoke with a voice calm and cold. "I wondered, how long before you stopped hiding?" The men hesitated, perhaps expecting hysteria, not composure. But madness was her weapon now. She stepped forward, arms spread as though welcoming them. "Do you hear him too?" she asked. "Theodore, he is here with me." At that, a sudden crack of thunder shook the house, and for a heartbeat the men faltered. Superstition gnawed at even the hardest criminals. Then the violence came. One seized her by the arm, another clamped a cloth over her mouth. She bit down, hard enough to draw blood. The struggle overturned candles, spilling wax and flame across the papers. Fire licked at the floor, smoke began to curl upward. But through the choking heat, she laughed. Not a shriek, but a steady, ringing laugh that unnerved them more than resistance. Neighbors later swore they heard it. A woman's laugh cutting through the storm, carried on the wind like a bell. When the men fled, leaving her half-conscious amid smoke and fire, they carried nothing with them. No papers, no proof, only fear. She survived the blaze that scorched her study. The papers were gone, reduced to ash, yet the rumors did not stop. In fact, the fire gave them new life. "They tried to burn her out," the city whispered, "and still she lives." But Elelonina knew the truth. She had beaten them back for a night, perhaps even shamed them. But the circle would never stop hunting her. The only question now was whether her end would come by their hand, or by the madness that had become her only shield. The end did not come with a noose or a bullet. It came quietly, the way old scandals are folded into history. One morning, the milkman found her front door ajar, swaying in the breeze. Inside, the townhouse was silent. The walls still blackened from the fire, the air heavy with soot and damp. Elelonina was gone. Some claimed she fled, that she vanished into Europe with a satchel of surviving papers, her fortune hidden in coded accounts. Others swore she was taken in the night, carried off to Henley's asylum, where she died nameless and restrained, her warnings dismissed as delusions. A few whispered something stranger, that she never left at all, that her body was never found because she lingered still, a presence inside that house, laughing softly whenever the gas lamps flickered. In time, her name was buried beneath polite society's need to forget. Cromwell, Wright and Henley continued their climb, though each carried a subtle mark of her. Wright's speeches grew erratic, punctuated by sudden silences. Cromwell's eyes darted at shadows when no one else turned. Henley drank himself into a stupor before the decade ended. The circle endured, but they were never whole again. And yet, among the people, Elelonina became something more than they ever feared she would. Not a widow, not a madwoman, but a warning. Her story was passed in whispers in sewing circles and saloons alike, of a woman who dared name the men behind the curtain, who stood alone against wealth and power, and who laughed in the face of those who came to silence her. Some nights when the fog drifts heavy along Fifth Avenue, they say you can still see her townhouse. Not as it stands now, rebuilt and renovated, but as it was, curtains drawn, windows black, the faint glow of candles trembling within. And if you linger too long, you might hear it, a laugh, low and steady, winding through the dark. Was she a martyr of truth, destroyed by the circle she defied, or was she a madwoman consumed by ghosts of her own making? That question has never been answered, perhaps it never can be, but one thing remains certain. Elelonina's defiance carved a scar in the city's memory, one that power and silence could never quite erase. And for those who still listen, her story is not a caution, it is a challenge, a voice from the shadows asking, "When your turn comes, will you be silent, or will you laugh too?"